Hi and welcome to Academic Compliance Academy. In this video I'm going to talk about de-risking and compliance, or rather how do you comply with de-risking. So what is de-risking? FATF defines de-risking as a phenomenon where financial institutions terminate or restrict business relationships with clients or categories of clients to avoid the risk rather than manage the risk. So this is not just a thing happening within the financial sector. We see it all over. When businesses want to limit their risk taking, they get rid of clients. And sometimes the problem that occurs here is that this de-risking, where they want to limit their risk, start to increase a social cost because there is a side effect. So let's look into that. De-risking is only relevant in terms of compliance when the de-risking poses a social cost to society. We've seen it within money laundering, where a lot of financial institutions wanted to limit NGOs from their clientele because, well, NGOs want to send money and help people in jurisdictions that are high risk in terms of money laundering. So the banks say, okay, this is a high risk client. I don't really earn a lot of money on these. Let's just get rid of them. But the result is that then the NGOs cannot get a bank account and help any people. So here we can see that the social costs occur. And we have seen the same element happening from elderly people to small businesses with a lot of cash, where they simply do not generate enough profit to go beyond what the cost function is for the private company to have them on as a client. So we have some elements that drive this tendency of de-risking. First of all, the perception of risk is bad, and we people have to try to learn that risk is not always just a bad thing. Risk is just uncertainty. It happens every day all around the world, and what we need to be more reminded of on a daily basis is that we need to understand to which degree do we accept risk rather than all risk is bad. A second driver, I've already talked about this, is client profitability. So when it costs more to have a client than the benefits, the profits that you get, then you kind of want to get rid of them. That is connected to the increased compliance cost. When regulation increases, some clients become even more costful if they're high-risk clients, and then you tend to want to get rid of them and de-risk your portfolio. We have risk of sanctions, fines, everything. And then the last one, which is reputational risk, and people start to discuss, is this at all a risk? But certain companies will be affected if their reputation is affected from having the wrong clients at the wrong time. So we have to acknowledge this. It might not be a typical risk, but it is a risk. So how do we comply with this de-risking? Well, compliance here is depending on a type of problematics here. We have to look into it. So it depends on the type of risk, and it depends on the side effect. Is there a side effect? If you limit your clientele or your supply chain because you think that this supply chain is more risky than the other one, if it doesn't really pose a social cost to society, it doesn't really have a side effect, it's just changing one supplier out with another, well, then we cannot say anything about de-risking, and it is compliant to do so. Where the problem is when we have this social cost function. This is why in the following models I will focus on the theoretical generalization, where we will look at social versus private cost, but also lowest mitigation cost. So let's look at it. I designed this threshold model based on a purely old school coaching approach on transaction cost, just cost in general. This is from a paper from 2020. So if we look at this continuum going from low cost to high cost, we can state that in the beginning, if transaction cost and cost in general of risk is lower than profit, well, we earn profit and we will not tend to de-risk. if transaction costs of risk is higher than your profit margin, then you want to de-risk. But here at threshold 1, there's an extra element, and that is that lower than social cost. So your private cost is lower than the social cost. This is where inefficient de-risking occurs, because you might have a cost as a private entity, but the cost that you induce to society when you limit your client, when you de-risk, is greater. Hence, the efficient allocation would be that you should keep your client in your books. Of course, we haven't really seen regulators going in and doing deductions on this. And well, if we need this efficient allocation, there should of course be an incentive. But this is our main problem. When the cost of having it at the private entity is smaller or lower than the social cost, well, then de-risking problem really is a problem. Because if we move beyond threshold 2, well, then we have transaction cost of risk higher than profit, which means we want to de-risk, but it's also higher than social cost, which means if the private entity should keep the client, the cost is higher than if they got rid of the client and the cost that society would then have. Here, it is compliant to de-risk. That is an efficient de-risking. So we can see this, that there's something about the social versus private cost. And we can also see this in this model. Just generally, we need to think that when we want to comply, when our de-risking strategy has to be compliant, we have to make sure that the clients that we spill out from our books, get rid of, that they don't pose an even greater cost to society. Then it would be inefficient. I do know that profits are unnecessary for private entities. This is from a societal perspective. This is modeling. It's a theoretical approach. But there's one more element than just social versus private cost, and that is compliance in terms of cost function. Because if we have two companies, one in Denmark, for example, one in France and Europe, each of them have clients and they want to de-risk. Well, if the Danish company de-risk its French customers and there's a French company or business that can mitigate the risk more effective and with a lower cost range, then this de-risking is compliant, because we should then transfer the risk from the Danish company to the French. And the same accounts the other way around. But if the Danish company is better, for example, with clients in Denmark, to mitigate the cost at a lower rate than the French company is, then we should transfer the clients from the French company to the Danish one, and this would be compliant. The other way around would not be compliant, because then it's not imposing society with a larger cost, but it's doing it to another private entity. So we have these two ways of seeing it. We can either say social cost versus private cost, which is a part of the threshold model, but we also have to see private versus private. Can we transfer to someone else? Because this is also what we've seen in terms of de-risking problems, is that when we then de-risk clients, for example, within the financial sector, they tend to go to smaller financial institutions that are actually worse at mitigating the actual risk. Hence, we do not protect society, and there would still be a social cost because the risk is not mitigated. So we have to remind ourselves that we have two problems, private versus social cost and private versus private. So we can say that our de-risking strategy is compliant if our de-risking only occur where our cost in the private entity is higher than the one that will be imposed to society, or that our cost in our private business is higher than if another private entity were to mitigate that risk taking. That would be compliant. We still have some issues out there that we have to solve, especially who will make the impact assessment on who has the lowest mitigation cost. That can be a tough nut to really do. It's not really that easy. Also, who should pay? Who should pay for this social cost, private costs? Should it be a compensation, as I put up here? Should the states compensate the private entities for keeping clients in the book so we don't have an increased social cost? Well, maybe they should, in theory at least. Or should it just be consumers, right? Should pay to have an account? These are some of the problems that might also differ from product to product, sector to sector, and even country to country or region to region. This was a theoretical comprehension on understanding de-risking and compliance. And how do we comply with the de-risking strategy? How do we secure compliance when we want to de-risk? Stay tuned to this channel. Subscribe, and let's talk much more about compliance.